You have to share your screen, get everything all lined up. Okay, I think I will. Can everyone hear me okay? Because I'll just get started with the meeting. It's 10:02. Okay. My name is Beth Giannini. I work for the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, and I am happy to be part of our Western Mass Historic Commission Coalition steering committee, along with planners from the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, Mass Historic and Preservation Massachusetts. And for anyone who this is your first time joining us, we meet quarterly, and we have meetings to talk about and have presentations on various preservation related topics. And so this meeting, and we take turns hosting the meetings amongst the three planning regions. So this meeting is being hosted by the Franklin Regional Council of Governments. And we are talking about basically about resiliency and historic preservation or cultural protection, resource protection. And so we have three speakers today. We have Marybeth Groff from the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, who's going to give her presentation first. And let me see, some little bookkeeping. We will take questions in the chat. So if you have a question, please put it into the chat. And also, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the group. I know it's kind of hard to go around and do introductions, which normally we would do if we were meeting in person. You can introduce yourself in the chat for others, and we will have a discussion at the end after we have the three presentations. So we'll start with Marybeth's presentation, and then we'll come back and then introduce the second speakers. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. And thank you for having me. I'm Marybeth Groff, as she said, and I am the Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Coordinator at the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency. If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. This slide presentation is a fairly good size presentation, so I'm going to kind of skim through a lot of the slides, but you'll have the slides afterwards to get the information. And so I am responsible for the state's Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. And for those of you who are not aware of that, FEMA requires every municipality in the country to have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan. So that provides them access to pre and post disaster funding. And so in 2018, Governor Baker issued Executive Order 569, which required the state to combine their hazard mitigation plan along with the climate adaptation plan. And so it also required state agencies to have vulnerability assessments. And it also, through the executive order, it provided some municipal support, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then in 2018, he issued the environmental bond bill, which actually codified Executive Order 569 going forward. So next slide. And so I'm just going to go quickly through. So climate mitigation and climate adaptation, for those of you who are, there's so many terminology and so many words, people, kind of interchangeably use different terms. So for the purposes of this presentation, climate mitigation is about greenhouse gases and reducing emissions. And then climate adaptation is about becoming more resilient, strengthening our state against natural disasters and climate change. So we'll talk about a few things going throughout. And I want to apologize, I forgot to say this out front. I am actually at an airport, so you're probably going to hear some background noise, so I apologize for that. Next slide. And so this is just a slide on the greenhouse gas emissions. And so in 2021, he created the climate law, is what we refer to it. And it talks about how the state wants to hit their net zero by 2050. They also issued the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, the CECP, for 2025 and 2030. And then the 2050 CECP is going to be released later this year. But that's just about how we are handling the reduction of greenhouse gases. Next slide. And also prior to the climate law, this Commonwealth had an environmental justice map. They identified environmental justice populations throughout the Commonwealth, and they created a map. And this resource is on mass.gov for you to see, and you can see the map on the screen of all the different pockets and areas that have environmental justice populations. And part of the Climate Act, they established the creation of an Environmental Justice Council, which was established this past July. Next slide. Next. Sorry. All right, so now you can keep going to the next slide. So one of the things that the Commonwealth is working on is a climate change assessment. And that was started about 1.5 years ago. It is being led by EEA, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And that is going to provide the statewide risk assessment. It's feeding into the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, which I'm going to refer to as the SHMCAP. There's lots and lots of acronyms in this world. And so we are, with the climate change assessment, we are looking at 5 different sectors. And you can see it on the right-hand side: human, infrastructure, natural environment, economy, and governance. And so we're looking at impacts to those sectors across impacts from the climate stressors. So that's your temperature, your precipitation, sea level rise, against the hazards that the Commonwealth experiences. So extreme heat, flooding, droughts, etc. And then the findings from all of that will inform this SHMCAP update, which is a 5-year required update, and we've already started that process. And it'll also inform the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness 2.0 program. They're in the process of revamping their MVP planning and project process. And so I'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. But on the bottom right, it just shows you the regions that the climate assessment will provide summary statements and summary reports for those 5 sectors against the stressors and the hazards. Next slide. So part of that, we are taking the 5 sectors, and we established and we identified 39 impacts across those 5 sectors. And so each impact was assigned an impact urgency score, and those urgency scores are based on magnitude of consequence. So how bad will it get? What do we expect from that impact? It talked about disproportionality exposure. So are there socially vulnerable populations being unproportionally impacted due to the hazard, and the impact? And then what adaptation is currently being done and what is not being done? Like where can we improve? And so based on those 3 criteria, we're going to actually prioritize the impacts. So that prioritization will then fold into the SHMCAP, and we'll be able to identify statewide actions to address those impacts. Next slide, please. Nope, the other way. Okay, and so quickly, so next steps, so we're going to draft some reports. So this is what they're looking like, and that's just going to summarize by region the impacts and the by sector. So you'll have an understanding of how the various regions are being impacted by climate change. And so mid-December the report will be released, but in late October, we're going to release the draft for public comment. So everyone on this call will have an opportunity to provide feedback. And then through the SHMCAP update process, that has already kicked off. And so we will also be reaching out to our partners, both state agencies, local communities, some of our stronger nonprofit or any actually organization that kind of lives within this world and has the ability to contribute. We will be reaching out, we'll be developing strategies through some workshops. So keep a lookout for that. Next slide. So this is just summarizing the SHMCAP. So it's required, like I said, every 5 years for FEMA to reapprove it. So we have to update it. We have to look at what we said we were going to do 5 years ago. We have to make sure that we're actually moving forward with strengthening our state and implementing the actions. And so so this time, not only are we doing the state agency vulnerability assessments, but we're also doing a capability and gap analysis. So we're looking at what we are currently doing towards climate adaptation and where our weaknesses are. And we will be strengthening, we'll be also developing actions based on those gaps. So that plan will be released in September of 2023. That's when the 2018 plan will be expired. And so the 2018 plan was, like I said, because of Executive Order 569, it was that combined plan. So it was something completely different. And through that process, we developed a new team that would implement that, the SHMCAP. And if you want to go to the next slide. So the team that was created was the Resilience Mass Action Team, the RMAT. Some of you may have heard of that already. RMAT is comprised of 9 climate change coordinators, so a climate change coordinator for each secretariat to ensure that their relevant agencies are implementing and doing what they said they were going to do in the SHMCAP, and just to ensure that climate adaptation, climate resiliency is being looked at and included in their day-to-day work when possible. And so one of the actions that was created through the RMAT was the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool. Some of you may have already heard of that, but that is a tool that originally was developed to help the state in our capital planning process to ensure that any money that was being spent was done so in a climate resilient way. Next slide. These next few slides, I'm actually just going to go through very quickly. So the tool, for those of you who have not looked at it or had an opportunity, it is not just for state agencies. Any community can use them. And it looks just at a broad kind of look at the project and their impacts. And, and it also will provide guidance and what is the best way to plan for this project. And it really is a planning tool. It's designed to help at the very onset of a project identify kind of what your vulnerability will be to climate change as you move forward in the planning and design of your project. Next slide. And all of this information can be found on resilientma.gov. So you need I shouldn't say very little, you need very little. It will take, not 15 to half an hour to input a project. And so you just need the name of the project, you need the internet, the computer, and you can just run through the prompts as you enter the tool. And you can, in order to get into the tool, you just need to submit a request for access to it, and then they'll give you access. So your key outputs are the preliminary climate exposure and risk ratings. It's the recommendations for the climate resilience design standards, as well as questions and guidance, implementation questions and guidance. At the very end, you'll get a report. So next slide. Again, this is just kind of shows you the outputs, the preliminary, I can't say that word, climate exposure. And so it looks at environmental justice populations, it looks at your ecosystem benefits, and then your scores based on sea level rise and storm surge, your extreme precipitation, riverine flooding, urban flooding, and then extreme heat. So those are the kind of the hazards that it is assessing for your project. Next slide. And I'm not going to go into any of these, so you'll be able to look at this after the fact, but this is just more information on the tool. So you can go to next slide. Again, next slide, but you can see the map. It shows you sea level rise and storm surge designs 2030, 2050, and 2070. So you'll be able to assess what the project site area will look like. So there are some mapping capabilities within the tool. Next slide. Again, so piloting and implementation, we're doing it for the statewide capital planning process, and then the municipal infrastructure grant programs, as well as the MIPA interim. MIPA has developed an interim protocol, and so there's actually more to come on that. We're starting to use it more and more, and we're hoping communities can use it as well. Next slide. So the other tool for local communities is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. We are at 97% participation, which is wonderful. And part of that also, our communities are allowed, or it's easy for communities to integrate their hazard mitigation plan for FEMA. They're kind of very similar. There's a little bit of difference to it, but not much. And it's kind of it's economies of scale, and it benefits communities if you're doing the two of them combined together, because it's less work. And so also with the MVP program, they have the action grants, which to date they've awarded approximately $100 million in climate adaptation actions. Next slide. Again, so MVP, so this is just a snapshot of all the grants that have been issued throughout the Commonwealth. So there's planning, assessments, capacity building, regulatory updates. They've funded design and permitting, and also just actual on the street construction. Next slide. And so what they're doing now is they're revising the MVP program to make it more action-centric, to help communities identify and implement strong projects that, it'll be more project focused, because most of the communities have already done the planning process. And so that will be able to be updated easier. And so right now they're in the November to December, so they're piloting process with a review panel. December to January, they're going to be finalizing that process and developing materials. And then in the spring of 23, they'll be launching the new planning program. So for local communities, they'll be able to take advantage of that. Next slide. And so the next thing I'm going to talk about quickly, and so is for Silver Jackets team, which are teams run through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So Massachusetts has a team, and I am the state coordinator for that team. And every year they don't provide funds, but they provide technical assistance. So this year, for the fiscal year 22, we're doing a flood-proofing study of historic buildings on Cape Cod. And so right now, we've already kicked off the project, so it's in the very beginning stages. So we're going to look at approximately 15 historic structures in the flood zones and the flood hazard areas. And we're going to provide guidance on what types of projects these communities can implement to strengthen these historic structures against flooding. And so the towns that are going to be assessed is Provincetown, Falmouth, and Sandwich. And you can see the alphabet letter soup of all the different agencies that are assisting with this. And then the final product, as it says, is a detailed report that will serve as a resource for the communities to strengthen their buildings and their assets. Next slide. And that's it. So thank you very, very much for having me. And I hope, if you have any questions whatsoever on all the information that is included in these slides, please do not hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to help.
Thank you, Marybeth. That was great. And I think, are you jumping off of the call, or just logistically so we
Yeah, no, so my flight is at 11:20, so it's 10:20, so I would imagine they're gonna start boarding me probably around quarter of, 10
okay.
of 11.
I wanted to just check if there was anything specific in the chat. I don't know if Stacia's been looking at it to that was specific for
So,
Mary Beth.
yep,
See.
there's one, so one question is,
Right.
what is environmental justice population? So if you go to mass.gov and search environmental justice populations, it will pull up and it'll just describe what what the criteria is based on. It'll provide a map so you can see where those populations are, but they're populations that are they're like socially vulnerable populations that are impacted by climate. They're impacted by various different criteria. So I prefer for you to probably go to that website so you can get the best information. And they are in the process right now of reassessing, and so there may be some updates coming. But the map right now, the data is from 2020. And then funding for Silver Jackets team. So there's no funding. So every year Silver Jackets puts forward this technical assistance opportunity. And so there's no funds attached to it, but we bring all of our federal partners together and state partners together to provide a technical resource. So like I said, we're doing this flooding study, floodproofing study on the Cape. We have done a educational promotional process in Boston for high water marks to show along the coast what the storm of record is, and then what climate change is going to, how that's going to impact the level of flooding in the future. And then we've also done like dam safety, plans, things like that. So it's not funding, but it is technical assistance. And so that happens every year. So let me know if you have a project, or a community that has a project, because we can talk about that.
Great, thank you. And then I see another question. Is there a comprehensive list of the municipal infrastructure grants you mentioned?
Yes, so if you go to mass.gov and type in MVP, you can pull up, and there'll be a kind of like a grant portal there, and you can look at all the various grants that have been issued.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see. I think that seems like in the chat right now, that's covered all of the questions for you, Marybeth. Thank you so much. And this is wonderful, because I don't know, I can't remember if I mentioned this when we started, kind of our intention with putting this presentation to these presentations together was to kind of give the bigger picture on resiliency, and then kind of drill down to what you can, opportunities locally. So it was great to get kind of the big picture of state projects and programs, and then kind of hear more about a local thing happening on the Cape, which I think is fabulous. So
right,
thank you.
And I would just say to look out for the SHMCAP update process, because we will be reaching out to local communities and our partners to help inform the strategy development process. So we'll be doing workshops, multiple workshops, so folks can join in that. But also the climate assessment will be open to the general public for comments. So please keep a lookout on that, and I will make sure that I send you information and include you on any kind of informational emails that are going out, so you can pass it on to your members.
Okay, great. That's great. Stacia from Preservation Massachusetts kind of keeps the email list, and we have kind of a ever-growing list of folks that we send meeting notices to. So we'd be happy to share information with them. And so thank you again. Before we kind of head into the next presentation, which we will do in a minute, I just wanted to introduce, because I'm looking at the faces of my colleagues who are part of the steering committee, and I just want to mention names so that we're acknowledging from the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, Laura Brennan and Chris Skelly are kind of have been involved with our group, and we help to plan and host meetings. And then the Pioneer Valley Planning, Shannon Walsh from the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, Jennifer Doherty and Ben Haley from Mass Historic, and Stacia Capelson from Preservation, Massachusetts. I feel like I failed to mention their names at the beginning of the meeting, and I wanted to just mention them, and if they want to chime in with any information, feel free to do that. Our next presentation is Alejandra Moutenot. I'm sorry, I knew I'm going to pronounce your name incorrectly.
No, that's okay. It's Moutenot.
Moutenot.
Yeah.
And Evan Knight from COSTEP are going to give us a presentation. And I just want to check in. Do you need me to share your presentation, or are you okay running the Zoom?
I'll run the Zoom, and then Alejandra, when we get to the interactive portion, can you share the screen as you want?
Yes, I think I'm able to share the screen.
Okay, great. So I'll just get this up and running.
And thank you in advance. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here. Are you folks able to see my screen or my slides here?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for having us. I think it's great to be able to share what we do in the emergency preparedness space with folks. I work for the Mass Board Library Commissioners, so I represent, and my title is Preservation Specialist, so I work with libraries in the Commonwealth that seek to preserve their community memory collections, local history collections, through some grants, as well as through programmatic work. And Alejandra is digital archivist with the Mass Archives, so they're a collections holding institution themselves, but she also represents town clerks and archives across the Commonwealth as well through some other projects. But long story short, although we work for the state, this project, COSTEP MA, is very focused on enhancing the emergency preparedness of cultural institutions very broadly. So not just libraries and archives, but institutions very broadly across the state. We're a small volunteer group. We're not chartered, so it really is a volunteer operation that from which we have representatives from Historic New England, a librarian from Harvard, an archivist from Boston College, and previous commitments from folks, or previous help from folks from Mass Historical Society, Boston Public Library, and also conservators in private practice throughout the Commonwealth too. Now, that's on the cultural heritage side. One of the things that we really believe enhances disaster mitigation and improves disaster response for cultural heritage institutions is developing connections with and convening meetings with emergency management professionals. So that's sort of the second, but very important focus we have. It's not just on the cultural heritage side. A lot of the work is trying to bring together those folks with emergency management professionals. So, you know, in our small volunteer group, we're also very lucky to have regular reps at our executive committee meeting, again, all volunteer, from MEMA, a colleague of Marybeth's, Ben Hiltonen, from Boston Office of Emergency Management, even folks from the Department of Interior, as well as a group called HENTAF, which is a collaboration between the Smithsonian Institution and FEMA. So that's kind of our steering committee. And what we do together is produce relevant information, such as the events, services, and resources. And that's what I'll go through first in the next few minutes. And then the third point on this slide is a new project that's hosted by MEMA that Alejandra is going to walk through. I guess if there was a takeaway or a call to action that we'd like to share is that again, we're a very operational organization, so we're going to be less maybe funding oriented than Marybeth's presentation was. We're going to be very operational, in which a cultural heritage institution or someone who, as an example, might manage or steward a historic property in Western Mass should feel very free to get in touch with our organization, learn about how to improve their and emergency mitigation planning, as well as what to do in the event of an emergency for their collections too. So I'm going to run through some of our resources and services. The first is actually basically information. We're gathering a lot of relevant information that is solely focused on disaster mitigation and disaster response. And so this is just a few screenshots of our website, and the website is listed above. And these slides we're happy to share later as well. But this is, again, a screenshot. In the middle, you'll see sort of our blog function, and this is an older screenshot, but it will look the same. Just we put out at least 2 meaty blog posts per month, and again, solely focused on emergency preparedness and related points. And we think that you know, our group together talks about what we can put up and we post. So we do think it's relevant. Not a lot of fluff there is what I'm trying to say. Now, on the right-hand side, there's 2 other important features I'd like to point out. There's a few organizations in red you'll see for immediate collections advice contact. There's a few organizations listed there, phone numbers and emails, who can advise free of charge collections institutions on what to do if they have a minor collections emergency. Most typically that's going to be a water leak, but they can also ramp up if it's a more regional disaster and there's flooding among their collections. These are the numbers that one can call immediately for 24/7 response on how to respond to collections. The first number is Natural Heritage Responders, and that's a group convened by conservators, so specialists in formats in museum and library formats of all sorts. The second is a New England based conservation practice, and they're focused on libraries and archives. And the third is also library and archives. Going below on that side navigation is our email list, and that's a really key function of what we do as well. We convene emergency management professionals with cultural heritage practitioners, right? And so the email is a very effective way that we put out information that bridges those 2 groups. So a call to action, if nothing else, if you'd like to share some of our resources with your constituents, going to the website should be helpful on multiple fronts, and joining our email list is a easy, low-cost way to get connected, actually zero-cost way to get connected with us. As part of our email list, we also offer opt-in weather alerts. So this is nothing that's maybe, it's not, don't have a monopoly on sending weather alerts. In fact, we just take what National Weather Service predicts in the state of Massachusetts and forward on a note to those folks who have opted into this service about potentially collections in damaging weather. This is actually a function that's performed by our partner at Historic New England, because he does this for his own properties. All the properties throughout the state, he does this for his property managers. And we're lucky to be able to tap into that service and give it to and provide it to those institutions that would want this sort of quick, brief notification about impending weather that might affect their collections before it actually happens. We do projects as well, about usually 2 per year. Here's a timeline of some in the recent past that we've done. In 2019, we had a rather large symposium open to cultural heritage practitioners and emergency management professionals interested in our space. That was hosted at the Bunker in MEMA in Framingham, which was a really special meeting. I think a lot of folks who attended took great actionable steps away from that. And what was presented is actually also on our website. It's archived on our website. In 2020, we did a tabletop exercise. So cultural heritage practitioners joined to walk through what they might do at their institution if there was in this scenario, if there was an indoor water leak during working hours. That's a minor emergency. That's something that's useful to walk through, but then it's complemented by, we also had another scenario, which was a large scale regional disaster. So this tabletop exercise is always recommended by emergency management professionals for institutions of any type and size. And so this was focused on collections holding institutions like ours. And we thought a good service to the folks who joined. Also, it was a free that we were able to put on. In building on that, on the tabletop, we also kind of convened a study group, a group study, asynchronous group study. So folks could do it at home on their own time with a discussion at the end of this time to study the incident command system. So MEMA and even FEMA offer a lot of services for to educate oneself on what's called the incident command system, which is the framework that emergency management professionals use in responding to emergencies of any sort. So having cultural heritage practitioners get up to speed on that system is always recommended by our emergency management professionals to us as well. So we were able to do that in again, a free way. Moving forward, I'll leave some of the survey and mapping components for Alejandra, but the GIS mapping project is something we're moving forward with and as part of a participatory survey, again, that you'll see in a few minutes, but generally about two events per year. One thing I wanted to touch on was how our group is pretty responsive to ongoing needs. So in the pandemic, we were one of the first to provide guidance to cultural heritage practitioners on what they might do for their collections. Again, we weren't trying to speak on emergency management during the pandemic. We were trying to speak directly to our constituents of collections holding institutions or even private homes, so collections broadly interpreted, what they can do in the pandemic to protect their collections. Obviously, that's continuing operations plans. And actually, it's a very long page. This is just the top screenshot, but we were one of the first to put some guidance out for remember cleaning guidelines. And basically, our response was try not to clean it too harshly or anything. But again, I'm not trying to make light of that. I'm just trying to say how we're very responsive. Because we're a small and informal group, but we're well connected and we're very committed to putting out good information in emergency preparedness for cultural heritage practitioners. Now, the next slide is going to start leading the segue into the current project we're working on. Obviously, we care about mitigating the effects of a disaster, so that's a lot of planning. So we offer some guidance on our website, but we also have some legacy forms that may be helpful for smaller and medium-sized institutions and nonprofits. And again, I'm thinking of this group probably represents a lot of smaller historic properties. Those sorts of institutions should feel comfortable in using some of the forms that we've previously done that might help bridge the gap between their institution and their partners in emergency response, who's going to be their municipality. So it bridges the gap between building that community relationship between the cultural heritage practitioner and the local emergency responder. So this is just a screenshot of that mitigation page, which has the links in the middle to a cultural resources inventory form. The first is an introductory letter that, again, helps bridge the gap. It's already a form letter that bridges the gap between a cultural institution and their municipality. The next two forms, or rather the third form, is for municipal offices and highlights helps one self-assess what collections they may have and how to protect them. The second one is the one I'll point to next, which the second link, which is cultural resources inventory form for cultural institutions, is more of a in-depth survey of who this institution is, what do they have, what's their building like, what risks might they have that they know about, what risks might they have that they're unsure about. And the goal of this form is really not just to self-assess, but again, it's to self-assess with an eye towards handing off to a local emergency manager or partner. So we think it's not just the self-assessment that's important, it's that relationship building that's important. And that's going to come into play in the upgrade to this form, which, and now is where I'm going to transition to Alejandra, but the upgrade to this form, again, this form at its core helps build resilience, we think, through that bridging of the gap, that opening of communication, that continuing relationship with your emergency management partner. And so Alejandra's going to show you how we upgraded that in the past actually year through working with our own partners at the Mass Emergency Management Agency and our executive board and network of subscribers as well.
Great, thank you, Evan. So speaking of resilience, I just want to begin by referencing the topic of today's meeting by contributing a definition of resilience, which we can use to think about one specific practical action. Evan's mentioning some calls to action that we can take to improve our capacity to respond to increasing disaster threats, especially those posed by climate change. So resilience, as defined by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is the ability of a system and its component parts to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, or recover from the effects of a hazardous event in a timely and efficient manner, including through ensuring the preservation, restoration, or improvement of its essential structures and functions. So taking this definition, I tend to think of resiliency as like a level up from preparedness, where preparedness can be much more kind of institutionally focused, like getting your team ready to respond to emergencies or producing and updating a disaster plan, for example. Whereas resilience moves us more towards community level engagement, building those relationships, like Evan said, increasing coordination, awareness, and our capacity to bounce back together. So how do we do this? How do we move from preparedness to resilience, and resilience at a community level? So another call to action that we have to take is to participate in this initiative, the Cultural Resources Survey, Cultural Heritage Facilities Survey. It's an initiative that COSTEP launched this past spring in partnership with MEMA and the Boston Office of Emergency Management. And it's a long-term participatory mapping project that asks cultural heritage repositories to submit information about your facilities. So submitting data points like location coordinates, known flood risk, and emergency contact information to one centralized data set to help improve response and recovery efforts in the event of large-scale disasters. The information that you provide is maintained and managed by MEMA, and as a participatory database, rather than a static list, the project ensures that the information is the most up-to-date information that we have. So just as an example, COSTEP has committed to putting out a call to participate twice a year, every year moving forward. So that means that we are continuously going to be asking folks to contribute data points if they haven't already participated in the survey, but also you'll receive an opportunity to update your own information if things have changed in the past year or so. So actually, if we could, Evan, maybe you could stop sharing your screen and I'll start sharing my screen. I can actually show you some of the other points of the form here. Okay. Okay, so I hope everybody can see this. I actually have the form up on my screen here. And just to go through this very briefly, so at the top we have a brief explainer of what this project is, and just a reminder that the data submitted are stored and administered by the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, or MEMA. Next, we have some self-explanatory form fields. So organization name is where you would put your own repository or institutional name. And then after that, you have a couple of options of self-identifying of what type of cultural resource institution you are, and you can check multiple options here. Following that, we have a couple of questions, just are you a public or private entity? And then I do want to clarify this parent organization field. So the purpose of this project is to map facilities. And so you'll want to submit one form per facility or site. So if you're an organization like Historic New England, for example, that has a number of different historic homes, you would fill out one form per historic home. So this would be, for example, the Lyman Estate. And then you would indicate in parent organization that it's part of Historic New England. Next, we get into some information, and this is the info that's helpful for emergency managers and first responders, just some basic data points about your facility, including how old your repository or facility is and its known flood risk. And then down here, we actually get to the heart of the project, which is this participatory mapping mechanism. When you load the form for the first time, you'll be able to place your pin on the map, and you can see I've actually already put my pin here at the State Archives, which is where I'm located. And it's a really easy point and click type of mechanism. And this is the data that populates the actual map component, which we'll see in a minute. And then we also just have some other basic self-explanatory form fields asking for your address, your emergency contact information, any other questions or any other information you think that we should know about your facility. This is where you could put additional emergency contact information. You could also put in some additional information from like the cultural inventory resources form that Evan mentioned, just basic data points you think would be helpful for emergency managers to know about your facility and your collections. And then once you submit the form, that'll take you to the actual map, which you can see here. So we have a really great representation of folks who've already participated in this project, but this is an ongoing project. So we're wanting to get more and more participation as we move forward. So a couple of things to demonstrate to you. If you click on a pin, you can actually see the information about that particular cultural heritage site. And then you can also actually use this up arrow to reveal tabulated data of all of the information that appears on the map. And under options, you have two options here that I'll just point out. You can actually export all of this information to comma separated values. So you could use this to put into other mapping mechanisms. If you wanted to, for example, overlay this with something like another map layer that demonstrates sea level rise, you could do that. And then you can also filter it. And so what I'm going to do here is just go to organization type and type in library. And here you can filter to just the libraries, for example. So this is the sort of the public facing component of this data set. I think of this project as moving towards resilience because it improves and it accelerates coordination at various levels of emergency management. And it has the potential to deepen connections and coordination between cultural heritage sites through visibility on the map. Participating in this project and including your data increases our collective resiliency in the face of disaster threats because it does the following. It enables emergency responders to quickly pinpoint who might be impacted in a specific disaster threat zone. It supports local and state hazard mitigation planning by improving assessments of the impacts to cultural heritage in the state, which secures funding, as Marybeth mentioned, for mitigation measures that reduce disaster losses. It increases the visibility and importance of our cultural heritage sites in general, and it ensures that they are included in disaster response and recovery activities. And it increases your visibility in statewide adaptation strategies related to combating the impacts from climate change. And then finally, it provides a comprehensive, centralized, and inclusive database of many types of cultural heritage repositories where other data sets might be lacking. So please get the word out and help us get more pins on this map by contributing your data and sharing this information with your networks to increase participation. And please get involved with COSTEP by signing up to our email list, as Evan mentioned, checking out our website and our programming, which we update periodically through blog posts and events. And feel free to get in touch with myself and Evan directly. So thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was excellent. Really great information and really relevant. So I'm wondering, we usually post the presentations on the Preservation Massachusetts website. So that's a great way for us to get the information out. But also, I think if we maybe if you could paste the link in the chat, we can also get it out through our email list, because it really, I mean, it'd be great to get that awesome map populated. So thank you very, very much. Are there any, let's see, we can also take questions at the end. There is a comment just about getting presenters' contact information, which certainly we can do that and email out follow-up information so that anyone who was not able to join us can get that information. But thank you for that great presentation, Evan and Alejandra.
Thank you. Actually, if I can add,
sure.
in our slides, we actually have, although Alejandra did a walkthrough live, we have links to both the survey form and the map. So if that's all right with you all, we can share the slides and then you can pull from there, as well as
Absolutely.
Our contact info.
Yes, perfect. That sounds great. Thank you. And the last presenter is Allison Gage, who works with me at the Franklin Regional Council of Governments. And Allison has been working with our Franklin County local communities on hazard mitigation plans and MVP programs. So she is going to talk about give the local perspective, or at least the regional planning agency perspective on working with our towns. So Allison, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. Can you see the full screen?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
Perfect.
So as Beth mentioned, I'm a planner with the FRCOG, which is the regional planning agency for Franklin County. And I mostly work on planning projects related to climate resiliency, which for me means hazard mitigation plans, open space plans, municipal vulnerability preparedness plans, energy reduction plans, and zoning bylaw updates. I'm really happy to be at this meeting to learn more about efforts ongoing around the state and the intersections between climate resiliency and historic preservation. So when I work with towns on hazard mitigation plans and MVP plans, we spend a lot of time talking about how specific hazards will impact the town. So for example, during the planning process, we'll brainstorm and consider how a flood event would impact community members, what infrastructure is at the greatest risk of flood damage, and how those damages could potentially hamper emergency response or isolate vulnerable residents, or even how their undeveloped floodplains would help to protect them from the effects of a storm. So when working on these plans, our goal is to assess what actions the town can take to help ensure that disruptions will be minimized to both town operations and community members, so they're not stuck in a constant cycle of having to keep bouncing back from a severe event. However, as we continue to see the impacts of climate change and how destructive these storms can be, more of the community members who participate in the planning process have begun to bring up how their historic properties and resources can be at risk. This is especially true in many of our towns in Western Massachusetts, where areas right in the floodplain or dam inundation zones are somewhat thickly settled due to historic settlement patterns. Take the village of Shelburne Falls, for example, which is shared between the towns of Buckland and Shelburne. The photo on the left is showing industries that were built up along the Deerfield River in the 1800s, such as the cutlery factory. And the left is what the same area looks like when Tropical Storm Irene came through in 2011. And a lot of our communities are still recovering from that storm. So during that storm, the water rose up to the walking deck of the Bridge of Flowers and severely damaged many of the buildings in that area. And at a meeting for this group, I think it goes without saying how valuable these historic resources are to the towns. They help contribute to the community's character. So when developing these hazard mitigation plans, we're definitely concerned with how intense and frequent storm events are becoming and how they can impact historic structures and properties. So as a part of the hazard mitigation planning process, we have the committees compile an inventory of known historic structures, which are largely taken from the Massachusetts Cultural Resource Information System Database, or MACRIS. It's a really great resource for us when we're working on these plans, and with the database updates that have recently gone through, it's been helpful to dig a bit more into what is considered to be significant or historic structures. On the left here is a clip of some of the historic structures in the Buckland Historic District. And I pulled this one out of one of our plans because of note is that all of these structures are located within the 100-year floodplain. And as we know, the 100-year floods are happening much more often than 100 years with climate change. So this aspect of the planning process helps the committee to understand what is at risk, because we are able to map where these structures are and then overlay them with known hazard areas. Also worth noting, I was recently working on a plan with a committee, and when I presented them with a list of historic structures, they didn't know about a lot of them. So even in just putting together the inventory and thinking about what was at risk helped to generate interest amongst the members who typically aren't involved in historic preservation projects. And then at the end of the hazard mitigation planning process, we work on an action plan with the committee to address some of the key vulnerabilities we identified. I again pulled these examples from Buckland's plan because they were a community where they had a lot of important historic structures located within the floodplain. And both of the action items here relate to comparing updated floodplain maps to the location of historic structures, because FEMA is working to digitize their maps and make corrections. Unfortunately, these maps still won't take heavier rain events into account, but as other maps and modeling become available, the Historical Commission could conduct other analyses. For example, I'm working on a watershed planning project. We had in the Clesson Brook, which is in the Deerfield River watershed, we had an engineer model flood flows and projected flood depths for 10-year, 100-year, and 500-year storms based on climate change models. So those could be used to compare against the location of historic structures and properties to make plans as necessary. Of course, that modeling will always be available, but there are those types of planning projects going on where we can make sure the Historical Commission has access to those studies so that they are also well informed of any new risks. So switching gears to MVP plans, these plans are similar to hazard mitigation plans, but allow the communities to focus more on the more urgent hazards they face. They're done at the state level. And they also open communities up to other funding opportunities for climate resilience. And again, during the planning process, we brainstormed with the committee members about how their community members' infrastructure and natural resources already are and will be impacted by climate change. I'm going to pull in some examples from the town of Whately, as historic sites were brought up as a top concern. So the committee had similar ideas about how to approach historic sites to the Buckland plan, which would first be to inventory them and identify appropriate solutions. In this case, developing nature-based solutions was left to be somewhat vague, but in these cases would likely revolve around some stormwater management techniques based on the location of the site. And I left out a slide related to this, but I also wanted to highlight that many of our towns identified records as vulnerable to climate change. A lot of our towns don't have their historic documents backed up digitally, and town staff are very concerned about long-term storage. Unfortunately, digitizing those records is really time-consuming and expensive, but the MVP program did fund record digitization for a town in our region that had their historic records stored in the basement of a building in the floodplain. So that was great news. And hopefully in the next round of plans, I can integrate more of the information that Alejandra shared. It would be great to have these committees know about the map and just make sure that other groups are aware just beyond the town organizations. Last, I just wanted to quickly highlight open space and recreation planning. As a part of that planning process, committees will also generate a list of historic features that are important to the community and map them. We have also been assessing the impacts of climate change on open space. So I think there are additional opportunities there to think about historic preservation and resiliency. If a community didn't do so when completing a hazard mitigation plan, or if they haven't gone through the MVP planning process. In terms of building resilient communities, making these types of connections within plans whenever possible can be an effective way to get more boards and committees involved and on board with prioritizing preservation. That's all that I have, but happy to take any questions about local planning and historic preservation.
Great, thank you so much. That was very informative and nice to hear kind of how it comes down, at least through the planning office and to the local level. I see a comment from Jen, Jen Doherty from Mass Historic, reminding towns that and folks on the call that the Mass Historic Commission, what goes into MACRIS is what the local communities give them. So projects like this are why it is important for your historic commission to regularly work on updating your survey of historic resources. We don't have an inventory. If we don't have an inventory form, we and others using MACRIS for planning and review don't know what that historic resource exists. So that is very important. I know MACRIS is so great. It's such a great resource, and it's kind of a go-to for all of us planners. It's like the starting point, and it makes it really easy and to be inclusive of all those resources. So anybody have any other questions? Any of the steering committee members have any questions? Like, you can just like unmute, I guess, and ask questions.
I had
sorry.
one that was submitted earlier to me prior to, and I'm not sure if those who are still presenters are able to handle this question or give some insight. The question that I received earlier was, how do state agencies analyze and balance resiliency infrastructure benefiting one jurisdiction against potential damage that new infrastructure may create for another jurisdiction's cultural resources? And the person writing had an example of in Newburyport, the Artichoke Reservoir, and some actions that are being taken that may threaten an ancient burial ground in West Newbury. So I'm not sure if anyone can sort of address how things are balanced between different jurisdictions.
I would say that that's way beyond what how COSTEP approaches our work. So, and then, my state agency works to support more broadly library work. And again, it's really not at that level of intermunicipal sort of cost benefit sort of analyses.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I know I read that question, and it's a really good question. I think it's a little bit deeper than what we're kind of trying to be. I feel like take a proactive approach to protecting the resources and kind of showing what programs are out there and how towns can plug in to those programs and make sure that the resources are known and they're doing and being as well prepared as possible. And I love the comments that Evan and Alejandra made about resiliency and kind of making sure that partners are like informed and can work together. And that's like a really important part of it, is just being knowing who to talk to and how to be in touch with each other is really important, because when an emergency comes, it's sometimes you're scrambling and when you already have those relationships, it makes it easier. I do see a hand. Dave.
That would be me.
Robson. Yep.
As usual, I'm doing 3 or 4 things all at the same time. So I'm trying to pay attention to what you folks are talking about. I'm on the Chicopee Historical Commission. I'm one of their Chicopee Historical Commissioners. And I just wanted to know is there a place where a website or something where I can get more information on how any of these programs might help or assist the city of Chicopee? Kind of a broad question.
From my understanding, so again, we're not really at the regional planning level. We're more at the operational level of individual sites, as well as with emergency management professionals. I think to help the city, the lens we would take is to understand who your emergency management director is, what the sort of infrastructure for responding to an emergency and preparing your community members through your emergency management office. Think about that connection, really emphasize to, I guess, historic, your constituents that represent historic properties and historic efforts to maintain a sort of cultural memory, make sure that they understand the mitigation and response framework that your city already does, and to connect with them to let them know that they're there and they're important, and what can they do from, these professionals to upgrade their resilience. It's a process. It's not like there's an end point. We're saying like you're perfect. So what one or two things they can do every year to improve their
Well, that helps. I mean, I know we don't just sign a form and everything's wonderful. I got that part, but there are dozens of historic properties in Chicopee, as you can well imagine. But thank you for that.
And actually, if I can actually loop it
Sure.
also back to this mapping project. So Macris is one very, very helpful sort of planning tool. I would say that ours is different, and we're not trying to be duplicative about what we're asking for. In fact, what we're asking for is even like the Twitter handle, the social media, the communication contact of an institution. So imagine if in Chicopee you have multiple institutions, instead of each individual cultural institution meeting with your emergency management director. If you have all that data aggregated into one participatory map, again, you can have the Macris data, but that's less sort of maybe effective in a response. So our data is really meant to be a preparedness and communication tool for an emergency management director. So if you were to share our map with all of the properties in your town that, I'm sorry, the city, I'm sorry if it's a town or a city, I should know that, but and if you can aggregate all those properties, share it with your emergency management director one time, that will kind of move things in a more easy way, I would say.
So it's definitely a city, and that's fine. That's fine. But and there are dozens and dozens of historical buildings in the city. So thank you.
One final thing, it's not buildings that we're totally focused on. That's more of the macro side. We're focused on the people behind the buildings.
No, okay, I understand.
And I would also say, kind of going the other way of what Evan's talking about, where in terms of reaching out to institutions, but also being involved in the planning processes of things like that Allison was talking about. Your community has all of these planning, things that they're doing all the time, whether it's updating a master plan, updating a municipal vulnerability plan, updating your open space plan. Those are really opportunities for the local historical commission members to get involved and kind of say, hey, wait, there are historical resources here. These are important. And really being aware of what's going on in the community and the planning efforts that are being undertaken, and then really being a voice for historic resources in those situations. And that really then makes the planning staff or makes the decision makers really aware of the historic resources and, focusing more on those as they go through those planning processes.
Oh, very good. All of that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, and as I said previously, we post the presentations from these meetings on the Preservation Massachusetts website, so they will be available, and I think that we will also be doing a follow-up email to everyone who's part of the email group to send out links to the COSTEP mapping project and other information that we have gotten from this meeting. I see a hand of Margot Jones.
Great, thank you. I'm Margot Jones from Greenfield Historic Commission, And we're hoping to update our historic inventory and applying for help with that this coming round. And it seems to me it's very gratifying to see that all these state agencies are talking to each other and trying to overlap and making it a dense web. I guess my question is, when we go out for consultants to update our MACRIS information, should we be emphasizing environmental justice areas? Should we be adding an environmental component to it? You know, our inventory is 25 years old, so it's time to sort of bring it up to date, but do it in a way that recognizes all these different factors going on.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if you are interested in a survey and planning grant for this year, certainly reach out to me or one of our staff after this call. We do like to talk to folks before they apply, so we can kind of get an idea of the project that they're looking at and what they're looking to do. You know, survey methods have changed since survey started in the 1960s and 1970s. You know, we don't just focus on those, you know, big buildings. We do try and really look at everything. And obviously, environmental concerns are now an issue. We have a couple projects recently that have related to, you know, changes in the community or preparedness projects, things like that. So if that's a concern in the community, if that's a focus in the community, you could certainly tailor a survey to focus on those kinds of resources. And then, like I said, we also don't just focus on, you know, the big buildings anymore. We try and look at, you know, all of the resources in a community, you know, all the people that have settled in a community, even if it's not, you know, the big famous George Washington slept here house, it might still be something that's important to the community. You know, it's an environmental justice area associated with minority populations, those kinds of things. So we have definitely changed our survey methods and, you know, really kind of consider what is beneficial for a community and what kinds of resources are in that community. But again, if you're interested in a survey planning grant, definitely reach out to us early. We will be announcing those in the next few weeks, but we do like to talk to folks beforehand to kind of help them develop the project.
And do you provide commentary on what appears to be weaknesses? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. We'll discuss the project with you, give you an idea of what it is, you know, if it's a good project, if there's ways you might structure it a bit better, anything like that, we'll certainly discuss that with you.
Great. Thank you. Wonderful.
Okay, thank you. And I see Susan, I see your hand with maybe a question.
I do. I just wanted to clarify one thing, because I think, am I correct that MACRIS only only has sites that are registered in the state registry?
No, so MACRIS is not the State Register of Historic Places. That's a common misconception, but MACRIS, as I said, it's a database, and it's anything that anyone has ever given us an inventory form for. So, you know, MACRIS includes a tree, MACRIS includes buildings from the 1970s, you know, MACRIS includes anything that someone at some point was like, oh, I want to document this historic resource. The buildings in MACRIS, just because they are included in MACRIS, or the historic resources in MACRIS, I should say, MACRIS has no significance or designation or anything attached to it. There are certainly buildings in MACRIS that have designations. There are buildings in MACRIS that are listed on the state register, on the national register, in a local historic district, those kinds of things. But MACRIS is really just itself a database, a collection of information. It has no significance or designation attached to it if a building is just in MACRIS.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you. Any other last questions before we end the meeting? And I guess we're always looking for topics for upcoming meetings for our group. So if anyone, that's another thing, if anyone has any ideas or burning historic preservation related topics of interest, please feel free to, if you think of it right now, you can write it in the chat, or if you want to email Stacia, we are always open to ideas for topics for upcoming questions. I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly who's the host of the next meeting, but we generally meet quarterly. So we will be meeting soon to plan for the next meeting, which will be in a couple months. But I want to thank our speakers for today. And if there's no additional questions, thank you, everyone. And thanks to Preservation Massachusetts and Aaron for running the Zoom for us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.